From Rabobank, this is a Rabo Research Food and Agribusiness podcast.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Consumer Foods to Go Wrap. Welcome to the audience. Welcome to Tom, that is back after holidays, all fresh and shiny.
Very relaxed.
And welcome again to Steve Runnicliffe, this time replacing Cyril.
No one can replace Cyril.
No, but you are as good as it gets. So really good. So we are happy to have you here. So what we are going to do is indeed like every other edition, we are going to respect the restaurant approach. This has been the welcome, and we are going to move to the menu. As a little reminder, the menu is when we discuss something that has been relevant, we have heard, read, something that caught our attention during the last month. We are wrapping now the month of July. And I know Cyril is very flexible and allows us to say whatever we want, but I'm going to be a bit more strict. And even if it remains very important, there are three themes that are not allowed. One is Hormuz and the Middle East. The drama continues. Let's skip that theme. The second one is an old friend that is back again, which is tariffs. And the third one, and is more for myself as a Spaniard, we are not going to talk football, even if we are wrapping up July.
Even if you're still celebrating.
Exactly. So, having said so, let's go ahead. And let's start with you, Steve.
So I think we're opening up with kind of what's on the menu, what's, what we've been working on, kind of recent reports, et cetera. One of the things, not a written report, but it was a really fascinating conversation that we did on the Liquid Assets podcast that, the beverage team produces. Back at the end of June, we had a discussion. We had on a few beer economists, someone from the National Beer Wholesalers Association, from the Beer Institute and the Brewers Association, all onto the podcast to debate a topic that's been really confounding for us, which is, why has the on-premise been so resilient for alcohol? We've seen this weird trend that's kind of hard to explain with everything else that's going on, where spending on alcohol in the off-premise has actually been declining faster than sales in the on-premise. And we've seen this shift that kind of happened after COVID that maybe you could kind of understand, but it's only been gaining momentum, right? And we see this, so it kind of confounds some of the things that we've been thinking. It was actually one of the things that when I noticed really changed my thinking about what's happening in alcohol. But I mean, it's this kind of weird phenomenon that's been happening. And so we all debated it, and we did it in, what we like to do on the podcast, which is kind of go through a draft, and each pick an idea. And, the ideas that some of the, between Burkhardt and myself and the different economists, there were varying degrees. I don't think any one thing, that was one of the conclusions that we reached, is that there's no one explanation for it. But, we tossed out, things like the K-shaped economy and, some consumers really struggling while others are doing okay. Just the recovery from COVID. We talked about some of the innovation in the on-premise that may be driving some of this. But, it was also interesting. I think for me, one of the points that I raised was, just that I think for me, this reflects just a change in consumers' relationship with alcohol. It is still used as for socialization occasions, et cetera. But when we saw past downturns like the global financial crisis, what we saw was consumers pulling back on going out to the on-premise and shifting down in price points, but maintaining overall alcohol consumption. Now we're seeing something really different, and I think it reflects a change in alcohol consumption. But there were also some contrasting ideas, because one economist said, no, it just reflects consumers have more money than before, that we are richer. And this kind of goes to some of the, some of what we hear from a lot of macroeconomists, that, the American economy continues to actually do really well. Consumers have more money. We've, wages have outpaced inflation growth, and things are great. I have some issues with that, but it is one of the theories that was raised. I thought it was a really interesting discussion.
It sounds interesting. And okay, from Europe, I don't understand as well as you guys do the American consumer, obviously. But to me, it's not surprising that the on-premises beverages bounce back a bit, because it's still cheaper to go out for a drink than to go out for a meal. So in that sense, it makes sense. What is a bit surprising is that it is alcoholic drinks and no longer non-alcoholic drinks. So I think that's what is remarkable, if you ask me.
I'll just add something. I saw my elevator ride up to the office this week. They have the little screens with "Did you know" facts. And actually, I saw something that I thought of you, Steve. It was some data analytics group, IWSR, actually reported that 74% of Gen Z had a drink in the last 6 months. And that's up on the 3-year average of 66%. So I'm curious about that shift too, that the consumers are maybe Gen Z yet to come around to alcohol.
The idea that Gen Z doesn't drink, I think, has to be debunked. They do, right? It's just a different relationship, at least from what I see. And one of the things that came out of it was, out of the discussion that I thought was, really relevant, is that there has been a shift, at least in the U.S., of who's drinking, right? Because what we've seen is a decline in the percentage of males that drink, and a real rise in the percentage of females that drink. They maybe drink less frequently. They don't drink nearly as much when they go out. But when you look at where, this is a great stat that was raised, and since in the past few years there's been a rise of something like 3 million women have entered the workforce and only 1 million men. There's a real gap there, and so the phrase that was raised is no dinero, no cerveza. So like younger men don't have as much money, and so they're not spending it. That's part of it. Part of it is to your point, Maria. This issue of how much it costs. It's we've seen a real rise in inflation, and the cost of drinking in the on-premise has actually risen more, and yet that's where consumers are spending. It seems like restaurateurs are raising prices more to cover the cost of rising labor costs and whatnot. But consumers are, when they go out, that's where they consume. They're consuming less at home, because I think it's just a very different occasion. I know as a Spaniard, it's different. It was a weird thing during
absolutely.
COVID.
Yeah. Every country is different. But I think it's worth monitoring, because if Gen Zs are now discovering alcohol, no doubt they will, the positive trend will continue with a positive consequence for all alcohol suppliers, obviously.
Yeah, that would be nice. Go.
That would be nice for the industry. Tom, what can you share with us apart from your holiday photos?
Maria, I know you're running a strict regimented process here. Am I allowed to talk about anti-obesity medications at all? So no. Okay. So what I've heard a few times, and I thought this is really interesting, is anti-obesity medications like Ozempic and GLP-1s are getting a lot of blame for some of the challenges we're seeing. Alcohol, to segue from alcohol is kind of one of those. An interesting one was potatoes that have had some recent blame. People are, there is a potato glut that's gone on, and potato prices have really come off. And people are saying, oh, it's GLP-1s, it's anti-obesity medications. And it's like, well, like so many things, you look into it and there's so much going on. For one, Belgium had a record harvest. You also have China, India, and Egypt all now producing more potatoes and exporting more. And frankly, they're very, very cost-effective producers of potatoes, to put it that way. And so prices have kind of come to a point where, there have been stories of potato farmers giving potatoes away. Demand has been a little softer, admittedly, right? GLP-1 and Ozempic and so on are playing a role. But so is the economics of going out to eat, right? So we've talked a lot about this in our food service reports, where the cost of going out to eat is one of the most inflated categories since the pandemic, up 37%. And so when consumers are going out, they're eating a little bit less. They're pulling back on their add-ons, like maybe instead of a large fry, they're getting a medium fry or a small fry. So their add-ons are a little bit less too. And then you kind of, think about peak calorie consumption in the US, where we've probably seen the US hit actual peak calorie consumption for a couple of reasons. One, population growth. With a tighter immigration system, you're going to see a lower immigration. Birth rates are also we're below replacement rate for births in the US. And then you tie on GLP-1s and the shifting consumer diet, and they're eating a little bit less per capita. So in general, I think it's not just potatoes; it's kind of a story for calorie consumption in general. But lastly, I want to talk a little bit about. I think potatoes are a good example of an opportunity to rebrand. I mean, we've been eating potatoes for probably 10,000 or more years, and I don't know if there's been a rebrand of potatoes in that time. But they remain on our plates, right? And they're going to remain on our plates. They taste great. They're affordable, filling, and frankly, they're misunderstood. One of my colleagues, Eric Gibson, he's an athletic guy. He likes his workouts, and he described them as an athlete's food, actually, for a pre-workout. They've got the potassium, they've got the fiber, vitamin C, and with the talking GLP-1s, fiber and more protein. Fiber is certainly needed. A bit of an opportunity for Big Potato to do a little bit of a rebrand and think about their position in the market, because it's not just anti-obesity medications.
No, I think you are right there. There are many more things, but one thing about potatoes, and perhaps that is the Spanish perspective, sorry, there is more than fried potatoes and crisps. There are healthier ways of eating potatoes. So maybe it's indeed what you said, Tom. Potatoes need to focus more on their healthier alternatives to French fries and crisps.
You've just got me thinking about potatoes bravas now, which is, I think...
That's not better. That's not better. Okay, this edition is getting very holiday oriented, I believe.
I think the phrase "big potatoes" will be the highlight of my day, Tom.
I think it's going to be a good one.
Yeah. The big potato mafia, the cartel.
I'm going to close this section with something a bit more serious, because I was thinking July would be a very quiet month. Of course, it hasn't been. Besides all the geopolitics, etc., we always have results. But on the top of that, we are seeing quite a bit of M&A activity, M&A deals that are sort of semi-cancelled or endangered, like RBE, Restaurant Brands Europe, Sinvent's divestiture, not being approved, the buyer not being approved by the brand owners. But more important, something drew my attention was interest in Poland. We have Seven & I interested on buying a convenience store. And once I started to look at Poland, we are seeing quite a bit of investment, direct investments also from Mondelez, from Capri-Sun. So it's a country worth watching. I think it's not a demographic growth at all, it's declining, but perhaps it's just economic growth, affordability improving, and the geographic position in the center of Europe. So something to monitor after the holidays. So we're done with the menu. Let's move to the specials. And the specials for the audience is where we discuss recent reports launched by Rabobank. So it will be our pick of what we think is more interesting and worth highlighting. And once again, please reach out to us if you want to receive those reports, or reach out to the analyst if you want a more in-depth comment. So let's start with you, Tom, this time round.
All right. I'm definitely going to get in trouble this time, Maria, because the report that I want to talk about, does address the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So apologies up front. But my colleague Jim Owen, he wrote the report "Cheap Until It Wasn't: How Abundant Resin Masked a Fragile Supply Chain." And actually, I think it's relevant for what we're seeing in food broadly, globally, and in the need to build towards more resilience instead of just efficiency and optimization. But what we really saw was food companies rarely view packaging as a strategic risk until it becomes an apparent major risk. And I think that this has been revealed and a key takeaway from the report. But the current situation, obviously, packaging prices are rising because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, tied, packaging and the resin tied to those energy aspects, as well as just the resin that has been caught up in the closure. But the problems did not start there. That's where we were able to isolate and highlight some of the supply chain risks of these packaging components. The crisis really has developed because of the concentration of supply based out of China and the Middle East. And buyers, frankly, they became very comfortable on the ample supply, low prices, and just frankly, maybe became dependent on that dynamic. And so when you see the closures, come up, it caught buyers off guard, and they realized, oh, we might be overly dependent here. And so the impact we could see is margin pressures, and then obviously the supply risk with suppliers prioritizing their long-term customers instead of the spot market buyer, and so on. So you see the challenge there, and then ultimately consumer inflation is going to be a factor as we see packaging components increase because of this. And so the key message here is that I think it applies to food more broadly, is we have this shift, and it's been an eye-opening experience since the pandemic. It's kind of been ongoing, and this latest strait closure is another reminder. Resilience trumps optimism or optimization. A bit of a Freudian slip. Resilience should be prioritized over optimization in this market. You still have to optimize, but the efficiency of the optimization model has shifted, and having a dual, triple supplier to ensure that you get those ingredients and those components for your product are really important. The greater geopolitical risks in this market also are going to remain. We expect, and our macroeconomics team expects, more shocks going forward, not fewer. So this isn't just an isolated event. This is an event amongst others that we expect to see in the future that will be disruptive to the supply chain. Not necessarily, another massive war like what we're seeing, but perhaps just other supply chain risks or shocks that I highlight the supply chain risks. And then lastly, I want to mention, we're seeing investments being made by companies looking to adjust to this. And ConAgra in their latest earnings talked about $125 million investment to actually bring production for some components back into house. I think it's more tied to protein production, but they're doing that to improve their resilience, they said, and to reduce the supply chain risks that we're seeing out there. So some lessons to learn from this excellent report from Jimoen.
I think it's a good moment to remind or to tag the date of today. We are recording this on the 24th of July. A month ago when we were recording, we were much more positive about the situation in the Middle East. It has all gone backwards. So indeed, it is relevant to flag that, Tom. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, no, I would just to add to Tom's comment. It seems like supply chain shocks are becoming more the norm than the exception. So I think Owen's point is really relevant. For me, I wanted to flag a report that came out from our ag commodities research team recently. The Pacific's long reach and its implications for ag and animal protein. Just kind of looking at the rising risk of another El Niño pattern. They're flagging something like an 80% or more risk of El Niño, and kind of the implications for ag commodities. And obviously there's always winners and losers, but it certainly looks like the losers are more abundant. I think they flagged something like maybe I think Argentina might benefit from some increased rains, and U.S. cattle might get some benefit. But overall, this is we're looking at hotter, drier weather that's gonna impact. For me as a beverage analyst, looking at things like coffee, which really does not need another light harvest. That's kind of disastrous. Coffee prices have been high for a while. Sugar prices going up, but also things like fish proteins. The aquaculture is certainly going to suffer. They've had lighter harvests of Peruvian anchovies, which feed into all kinds of animal feed. et cetera, et cetera. And, for me, I think about this, one, from, what it means for cost of goods sold, but also just for the consumer, right? If we start seeing another round of increased prices for things like coffee, coffee producers have tried to hold the line as they could on categories like coffee, but at some point you got to pass those rising costs through, and the consumers just seems to be, at least here in the U.S., just seems to be, digesting that last round of, major inflation, just kind of getting over that. And now it looks like, maybe this feeds into, more bad news for rising prices.
I think you are right. The report has a very detailed analysis of what it means for the different commodities or food products, like indeed fish. And what is important is also that they say, well, El Niño is already here, but the chances of having what they call a super El Niño are over 80% at present.
Right.
So that is clearly a red flag and a source of concern. I want to highlight very briefly another report, because our Dutch colleagues have produced a very in-depth statistical analysis about the correlation between consumer confidence and actual consumption. And I want to flag it because I remember talking to you, Tom, and you said that in the US, the correlation has been lost. Our colleagues for the Dutch market have done a very thorough analysis, and their conclusion is that for the Dutch market, the correlation is not lost, but where it is really strong is not necessarily with the sort of overarching consumer confidence indicator, but with one of the different indicators that it's consumers being asked, it's a good time for large significant purchases. This is one of the elements of the consumer confidence indicator, and the correlation between that one and actual consumption is very strong. In the Netherlands, I would expect that given the similarities with other Western European markets, the correlation will also be relevant there, and it can be used as a good proxy for what consumers are going to be prepared to do with their money, because unlike in the US, in Europe, savings are still very high. It's just a matter of consumers not willing to spend, and that is an issue because it's very difficult for consumer-oriented companies, for consumer goods suppliers, to understand or to forecast what can they expect. This can be a good indicator. And that is a very nice link with our next and final session, which is made to order. And in that one is where we share comments, questions, or requests we have received from our clients and contacts in the industry. And this time I will kick off because it links with just the research I flagged, because I had a couple of conversations with clients here in Europe, and their main concern, regardless of what is happening with supply chains and costs, is demand. Where is the demand? What can we expect? They are, of course, starting to prepare 2027 budgets already. What can we expect for next year? What is going to make things change? And that is the top of mind despite everything else. I think perhaps looking at this consumer indicator can help them a bit because, as I said, in Europe it's not so much a matter of affordability of actual financial pressure. It is, but not for everybody, but also it's a matter of consumers' attitude.
I think, Maria, the issue that you raise of consumer confidence is an interesting one, just because we see this gap between kind of what macroeconomists look at in terms of the consumer and how well the consumer is doing and where confidence is at. Consumer confidence was at, 90, running 90 to 100 before COVID. At least if you look at the University of Michigan Confidence Index, it was running around 90 to 100, 95 to 100, and now we're down around 50. So there's been just consumer confidence has fallen off a cliff, and yet, macroeconomists are looking at, all the top line numbers anyway, and spending is up, wages have caught up with inflation, disposable income has gone up. And I think all of that's true. But, when I try to reconcile that, one of the things that I suspect and look at, and some of the data seems to suggest, is disposable income has gone up, but discretionary income has gone down, because so much of what's in that, the core piece of inflation for the consumer is in housing, food, and transportation. Those things make up something like 70% of the budget, and those items have seen inflation rise much more than the overall inflation rate. So what's left over for discretionary items seems to have gone down, at least from my analysis. But that's
really interesting, Steve. Thank you for sharing. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, so perfect segue for me. I wanted to talk a little bit about where, in terms of where is the demand, what's going on in food service demand specifically, because, we see foot traffic data that shows consumers are still, it's relatively flat. People are still seeming to go out, but then you see some of the results of performance, and you see some tough sales numbers and issues with perhaps confidence in where is the consumer even coming back to restaurants. And truth is that it seems to be more of a sorting year. If you look at traffic by various brands in restaurants, you're going to see some that are growing. We've talked about Chili's before, that are continuing to grow very well in this market, and then others where they're seeing significant decline in traffic. So it's kind of, I describe it as a year of sorting, or at least a period of sorting in performance, that on average kind of washes out to be a flat growth story. Domino's had their earnings this week. They're kind of a story of obviously a big brand and operator who has significant scale to leverage and to make the most of that in the market. They're doing it through value offerings to the consumer. And their traffic for them wasn't weak. The problem that they said was ticket size issues. So people are looking for deals. They're doing discounted options, and so on. And they're just spending a little less when they do order. So they're not getting they're not necessarily getting some of the premium offerings that come with the option, with the order. But then also they highlighted that delivery continues to grow. So that convenience story with the consumer and the delivery space is demonstrating that people still will spend for that convenience opportunity. I also want to touch on In-N-Out Burger, because they're another one that continues to grow. And traffic remains pretty strong for them. They are tapping into that modern value proposition for the consumer, where it's not just what's the total price, it's what am I getting? What's the value, the overall value offering for me? And that includes the nutritional side, how much protein, is the beef fresh, and so on. And frankly, In-N-Out does kind of check some of those boxes. It is premium fresh beef. They do have very strong alignment with influencers. I think almost every other podcast that Joe Rogan does, he's talking about how much he loves In-N-Out burgers. But then they also have those kind of unique positions with, like, I guess you could call it a gimmick almost, but the secret menu, as they call it, with animal style burgers. So you feel like you're in the know because you know the secret menu items, and then you can order this. So it all kind of taps into that shifting modern definition of value for the consumer. Yeah. And an interesting story, but it just reflects that people are spending just more cautiously. But when they do spend, they're willing to pay up a little bit.
You touch upon two themes that are also present in Europe. It's about value versus price, and you touch upon some of the elements that define value as perceived by the consumer, and one of them is experience. And this fun factor of the secret menu hits right in there. And a second element that adds to value in Europe, at least for the European consumers, is also health. Elements that are perceived as healthier, options within the menu that are perceived as healthier. Not necessarily that they will always pick up the healthy stuff, but it is one of the things that, at least on certain occasions and certain public, value as value adding.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it's time to ask the bill and wrap up this edition. We didn't stick to the initial promise of not speaking about geopolitics, Hormuz, and the Middle East. But I
Sorry.
suppose it was unavoidable given the circumstances. And I'm sure we will come back to that more times before we close the year. We spoke, therefore, about costs, about inputs and availability. We also touch upon demand, and we also touch about consumers. And we also touch about specific elements like alcohol or packaging. So for the month of July, that was supposed to be quiet and uneventful. I think a lot has been happening. Dear audience, thank you for being with us. Don't hesitate to reach out if we can provide any of the reports mentioned or any additional discussion on the themes that we touch upon. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Steve, for sharing this time with us once again. And I'm looking forward already to our next edition in a month's time.
Thanks for listening to this latest Rabo Research Food and Agribusiness podcast. To hear more up-to-the-minute expert analysis, search for Rabobank on your favorite podcast app and follow our channels. Visit research.rabobank.com for more.